I received a phone call from my friends at the car center, and they were incredibly embarrassed. They had to tell me that Dean Elmendorf had vetoed my fellowship. The reason he gave was my criticism of Israel. This whole saga began last April when I announced that I would be leaving Human Rights Watch at the end of the summer. And very quickly, I received a phone call from the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, which is part of Harvard's Kennedy School. And they asked me, would I be interested in spending a year at the Carr Center as a senior human rights fellow? There was one caveat to this conversation, which is that they needed the approval of the Kennedy School dean, Doug Elmendorf. We all thought that this was a completely pro forma perfunctory thing. Nobody even gave it a second thought. It was just, a step that had to be going through. Somebody had to sign a piece of paper. I contacted Elmendorf on the assumption that I would be there starting in September and said, wouldn't it be good just to get together to introduce myself? And so we set up a video chat in July and had a very nice half-hour conversation. And it only got strange right at the end, where he asked me, do you have any enemies? Now, this is a completely strange question to ask, somebody who has run a human rights organization for 3 decades, because I have tons of enemies. And I told him, that's, in a sense, that's the hazard of the trade. That's what happens when you defend human rights. So I mentioned that both the Chinese government and the Russian government had personally sanctioned me. But, frankly, I had a hunch what he was driving at. So I mentioned that also I thought the Israeli government was not too fond of me either. And that turned out to be the kiss of death, because 2 weeks later, I received a phone call from my friends at the Carr Center, and they were incredibly embarrassed. They had to tell me that Dean Elmendorf had vetoed my fellowship. And the reason that he gave to Catherine Sickink, who was a very respected human rights professor associated with the Kennedy School, the reason he gave was my criticism of Israel. Now, since then, Michael Massing at The Nation has done a lot of work and figured out that there are certain very important donors to the Kennedy School who are very big supporters of Israel. Now, we don't know what donor influence there was, but it's hard to figure out any other rationale behind the dean's move, because Dean Elmendorf, doesn't have a public profile on Israel. He's not known to be somebody who's particularly concerned about Israel, but he does have these big supporters of Israel as donors. And indeed, if you look at, whom the Kennedy School has welcomed as fellows, it includes, former Israeli prime ministers, a retired Israeli Defense Force general, and indeed, every single year they bring in 10 Israeli officials through a funded fellowship. So there clearly is donor interest here. But Elmendorf isn't talking. I think that's the most likely explanation for what happened, and I don't know, frankly, whether he consulted with donors or whether he just feared what their reaction might be. Frankly, what worries me most is the message that this sends to other more junior academics. Because I'm not worried about my career. I have plenty of options. This is not a major setback for me. But the principle is horrible. And if the message sent by Elmendorf's rejection of my fellowship is that you criticize Israel, your academic career could be stymied, that's a terrible message to send to younger academics. And that's what really worries me, because I do think that the credibility of Harvard is at stake here. Does Harvard want to be known as a university where perceived or actual donor influence impedes academic freedom and intellectual independence? I hope not. So far, though, Harvard's reaction has been incredibly disappointing. Basically, it's a head in the sand reaction. They're not talking. They're hiding. They're hoping that this storm somehow passes. I fear that this happens all the time at a lower level, which just never gets attention. And which is all the more reason why it's important when there is an incident that captures the public's eye that we ensure that the university responds appropriately. It would be all the more disappointing if super wealthy, super rich Harvard still feels that it has to capitulate to donor concerns rather than uphold academic freedom.